The courtroom was filled with murmurs. The judge, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, sat at the front, his gavel tapping impatiently. He looked over the defendant, a woman who had come to the court today dressed in an old, worn-out suit. Her skin was pale, her face thinner than most, and her head bald. But the thing that struck everyone was the quiet, confident air she carried about herself. She didn't look sick. Not at all. Yet, the pale skin and lack of hair left everyone wondering about her health. The judge sneered as he scanned his papers. "So, Miss Miller," he began in a dismissive tone, "I assume you have an explanation for your rather unusual actions?" The woman nodded, her expression calm. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge let out a chuckle. He stared at her, his gaze moving from the top of her shiny, bald head down to her neatly pressed suit. The courtroom filled with the sound of his laughter as he looked back at his papers and shook his head. "A bald woman in my courtroom. And you're here to defend yourself in this case? You must be joking." For a moment, the room grew silent. Everyone in the courtroom, from the lawyers to the audience, was unsure how to react. Some exchanged uneasy glances. A few people tried to stifle their laughs. But then, Miss Miller stood tall. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke, not the slightest bit shaken. "Your Honor, I am here to prove that justice must be blind to appearances. To show that what matters isn't how someone looks, but what they're capable of." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Capable of?" he asked, a smile curling at the corner of his lips. "And what exactly do you think you are capable of, Miss Miller?" The woman didn't flinch. "I think you'll find that my understanding of the law is far superior to yours." At this, the judge let out another loud laugh. "You, a bald cancer patient, think you can outsmart me?" he scoffed. Miss Miller's eyes locked onto his, her expression hardening. "Yes, I do." The courtroom was dead quiet for a moment as the judge looked at her, his amusement slowly fading. His lips twisted into a thin line. "Well then," he said coldly, "I will enjoy watching you try." And that was when it happened. Miss Miller raised her hand and began speaking, her voice now firm and filled with power. She recited a series of legal precedents and court cases, cases the judge himself had probably forgotten about. It was clear now that this woman wasn't just a defendant. She was a legal genius. The courtroom gasped in disbelief as Miss Miller walked the judge through case after case, showing him the error in his thinking and revealing the flaws in the very laws he'd sworn to uphold. Her arguments were clear, precise, and irrefutable. With each point, the judge's face turned a little paler, his grip on his gavel tightening as the room fell completely silent. For a brief moment, it seemed like the judge would respond, maybe with a gavel slam or a biting retort, but instead, he sat there, stunned, unable to say a word. The court reporters were busy typing furiously, trying to keep up with the unexpected turn of events. And then, Miss Miller made her final move. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with finality, "it's clear that I am the one who understands the law here, not you. I demand that you reconsider the charges against me. If not, I will have no choice but to take this matter higher." The judge blinked. Then, he cleared his throat. Are you threatening me, Miss Miller?" Miss Miller's smile was slow but certain. "I'm not threatening you, Your Honor. I'm merely giving you a choice. You can admit your error, or I will make sure everyone knows about it." The judge's face turned beet red. He slammed the gavel down with a force that shook the room. "Court is adjourned," he snapped, but not before giving her one last, disbelieving look. But as Miss Miller walked out of the courtroom, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on everyone in the room. Could it be? Could this woman, bald from her cancer treatments, have actually outwitted one of the most experienced judges in the courtroom? The murmurs began again, but this time, they were different. They were filled with awe, respect, and fear. And the judge? Well, he was now the one who had to decide whether he had just been bested by a cancer patient, or whether he would soon have to face the consequences of underestimating her. But the real question was this: could anyone really win against someone who had nothing left to lose? The story of Miss Miller had just begun. Her quiet resolve was about to lead her on a journey that would take her far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The courthouse halls felt unusually silent as Miss Miller walked out, the weight of her victory still hanging in the air. Her footsteps echoed, each one seeming to reverberate through the corridors, announcing her presence to those who had witnessed her confrontation with the judge. The words that the judge had thrown at her earlier, those mocking, cruel words, now seemed to carry little weight. She had won, but she knew this victory was just the beginning of something bigger. As she stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, her mind raced. She could feel the hot sting of her body weakening, the exhaustion from her illness threatening to take over. But she didn't let it show. No one could see her pain. Not now. "Miss Miller," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see a young reporter, her notebook in hand, rushing toward her. The woman looked eager, but cautious, as if she wasn't sure whether she should approach the intimidating figure of the cancer patient who had just outsmarted the judge. "I just wanted to ask, about what happened in there," the reporter said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How did you do that?" Miss Miller paused, considering the question. It was hard to explain, to put into words the clarity she had felt as she tore apart the judge's arguments. It wasn't just about the law. It was about the injustice she had been subjected to, the bias she had faced from the very people who were supposed to uphold justice. She had worked for years to understand the legal system, to study every ruling and decision that came before her, and now it was time to use that knowledge. Time to expose the truth. I understand the law better than they think," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had fought battles much bigger than this one. "It's not about who I am or how I look. It's about what's right. And I wasn't going to let them get away with doing something wrong." The reporter looked at her, speechless for a moment. "But how are you feeling? I mean, with your illness?" Miss Miller's face softened. She had learned long ago that people often saw only the bald head, the frail body, the sickness. They didn't see the strength that lived inside her, the strength she had nurtured from years of fighting for her life. "I'm not going to let cancer define me," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "I'm not here for pity. I'm here to fight for what's right." The reporter seemed to digest her words, scribbling them down furiously in her notebook. "Is this just the beginning for you? Are you planning to take legal action against the judge?" Miss Miller's expression hardened. "If he's not going to do his job properly, then yes. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he's held accountable." She paused, adding, "And if it means taking it to the very top, I will." The reporter blinked, clearly taken aback by her words. "So, you're saying that you're going after him? You're going to expose him?" Miss Miller's lips curled into a small smile, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not going after him. I'm going after the system. And if he stands in my way, he will be exposed for what he is." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the reporter standing on the steps, her mind racing with the possibilities of what she had just heard. Miss Miller's quiet defiance had already started to spread, and the story of what had happened in that courtroom was about to go viral. Later that evening, as Miss Miller rested in her small apartment, the phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but her instincts told her this was important. Slowly, she reached for the receiver. "Hello? Miss Miller," a voice on the other end said, smooth and calm. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She stiffened at the voice. It was familiar, but it took her a moment to place it. It was the voice of someone in power, someone who knew the game and played it well. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice wary. The man on the other end chuckled softly. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been following your recent legal performance. Quite impressive, I must say." Miss Miller's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want?" "I have a proposition for you, Miss Miller," the man continued, his tone now coldly calculated. "You've made quite a name for yourself today, but if you want to really take down the judge, you're going to need help. I can offer you that help. I can offer you resources, connections, everything you need to win. But there's a price." Miss Miller sat up straighter, her curiosity piqued. "And what price is that?" "Simple," the man replied, his voice dripping with something dark. "I want you to work for me. Help me with certain matter, and I'll give you everything you need to expose this judge. You'll have the power to do whatever you want, but only if you accept my terms." The air in the room grew heavy as Miss Miller considered his words. She had just begun this journey, and now someone with power was offering her more power. But what was the catch? What did he want in exchange? "I don't work for anyone," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. The man on the other end sighed. "You don't understand, do you? You can fight this battle alone, or you can fight it with the right allies. But time is running out. The longer you wait, the more people you'll lose. The more power you'll lose." Miss Miller's grip tightened on the phone, her mind racing. Was she willing to make a deal with someone like him? Or was she strong enough to continue on her own? "I don't need your help," she said, though there was a hint of doubt in her voice. "I'll win this my way." The voice on the other end of the line chuckled. "We'll see, Miss Miller. We'll see." The line went dead. Miss Miller set the receiver down, her mind swirling. She could feel the tension building, the weight of the decision hanging over her. What would she do next? Would she go it alone, risking everything? Or would she accept the dark offer that had just been laid out before her? As she lay back in bed, her body exhausted from the day's events, Miss Miller knew one thing for sure. She had entered a battle that was far bigger than she had ever imagined. And no matter what happened next, she was going to fight. She had to. But little did she know, the real battle was just about to begin. The next morning, Miss Miller woke up with a heavy heart. She had barely slept, the phone call from the night before still lingering in her mind. The offer from the mysterious man, someone with resources, connections, and power, tempted her. It was an easy way to achieve her goals, to take down the judge and expose the flaws of the system. But something about it didn't sit right. She had always prided herself on standing alone, fighting for justice without resorting to shady deals. Yet, as the sun's rays filtered through the blinds, she couldn't ignore the truth. She was running out of time. Her body was weakening. The cancer was relentless, and despite her best efforts to remain strong, it was slowly eroding her energy. Maybe she needed help. Maybe this man could offer her what she couldn't achieve on her own. But what would it cost her? Miss Miller's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it and saw that it was the same number from last night. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Miss Miller." The voice on the other end was smooth, almost too smooth. "I trust you've had time to think about my offer." She sat up in bed, the phone pressed tightly to her ear. "I've thought about it," she said, her voice firm, "and I've decided. I don't want anything from you." The man chuckled softly, as if he had been expecting this response. "I figured you'd say that. You're a woman of pride, I can tell. But I'll say it again. Time is running out. If you want to expose the judge and make a real difference, you'll need more than your knowledge of the law. You'll need the right leverage, the right people, and the right tools. You think I can't do it on my own?" Miss Miller asked, feeling a spark of frustration. "Not at all," the man replied, his tone eerily calm. "But I think you'll find that the more you try to fight this battle alone, the more obstacles you'll face. And with every obstacle, your time is running out." A long silence stretched between them. Miss Miller gritted her teeth. She had always known that doing the right thing wasn't easy. But could she really turn down this man's offer? Could she fight against the very system that was stacked against her without some form of help? "I'll do it," she finally said, her voice resolute. "But understand this, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for justice. And if you try to manipulate me, I will turn on you without hesitation." The man's laughter filled the phone. "I think we'll get along just fine, Miss Miller. I'll be in touch soon." And with that, the line went dead. The decision had been made, but the weight of it settled in Miss Miller's chest like a stone. She had agreed to work with this mysterious figure, someone whose true intentions she still didn't fully understand. She had no choice. She needed the resources to expose the judge, to take down the corruption that had been festering in the court system for so long. But she wasn't sure what to expect next. And as she sat in her small kitchen, sipping on a cup of tea, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Days passed, and Miss Miller busied herself preparing for the legal battle ahead. She pored over case law, reviewed the judge's past rulings, and continued to build her case. But each day, Her body grew weaker. The cancer was relentless, and the treatments were taking their toll. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, the heavy fog that clouded her mind. But she couldn't afford to slow down. Not now. One afternoon, while going over a particularly important legal document, Miss Miller's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the mysterious man. It was a message from an unknown number. Meet me at the usual place. Midnight. No explanation. No signature. Just a simple instruction. Her heart raced as she read the message. The usual place? She hadn't agreed to meet anyone yet. What did this mean? But she knew she couldn't ignore it. If she was going to play this dangerous game, she needed to take every opportunity. She typed back quickly. I'll be there. As the clock neared midnight, Miss Miller stood in front of an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place had always been a symbol of secrecy, a place where shady deals were struck and power players met in the shadows. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back now. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The warehouse was eerily silent, the only sound being the echo of her footsteps on the cold concrete floor. Her eyes adjusted to the darkness as she walked deeper into the building, her heart beating faster with each step. And then, she saw him. The man stood near the far wall, shrouded in darkness, his face barely visible. He was tall and lean, wearing a sharp black suit that seemed to blend into the shadows. You came, he said, his voice smooth, yet with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. I said I would, Miss Miller replied, her voice steady. She couldn't let him see how nervous she felt. Now, what's this about? The man stepped forward, his face finally coming into the light. He was older than she had imagined, his features sharp, but his eyes cold, like a predator sizing up his prey. He looked at her with a strange mix of amusement and approval. I told you I had resources, he said, his eyes glinting. But what you need right now is information. You need to know what the judge has been hiding, and I can give that to you. Miss Miller narrowed her eyes. What kind of information? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The kind that could bring him down. The kind that will make sure no one questions your legal genius. But you'll have to trust me, Miss Miller. And trust, well, trust can be a dangerous thing. Miss Miller's mind raced. She had no idea how much of this was true, or how much of it was manipulation. But she didn't have the luxury of time. If this was the only way to gather the information she needed, she had to take the risk. Tell me, she said, her voice low. What do you want in exchange for this information? He stepped closer, his cold eyes locking with hers. It's simple, he said. I want you to deliver a message. A message to those who think they control this town. Show them who really has the power. The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. Miss Miller took a deep breath. She was already in this too far to back out now. Fine, she said. Tell me what I need to do. As the man began to explain the details of his plan, Miss Miller couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something much darker than she had expected. But in that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. No matter what, she would keep her eyes on the prize. Justice, the judge, the system, and whatever forces tried to stand in her way. She would take them all down, one step at a time. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. Miss Miller's life, once a quiet existence spent in a small apartment and focused on her battle with cancer, had suddenly become a high-stakes game. The meeting at the warehouse had marked the beginning of her dangerous alliance. She hadn't expected to find herself trusting the mysterious man, but his promises of valuable information about the judge were enough to convince her that she had no other choice. The man, who had introduced himself as Mr. Graves, had given her an ultimatum. If she wanted the evidence she needed to bring down the judge, she had to help him first. His requests were vague, but the implications were clear. He was involved in something bigger, something darker, and he needed someone with her legal expertise to help him pull the strings from behind the scenes. At first, Miss Miller had hesitated, but with each passing day, the pressure mounted. The judge, who had once mocked her in court, was now a symbol of everything she despised about the legal system. His arrogance, his indifference to justice, it had all pushed her to the brink. If working with Mr. Graves meant she could bring him down, she was willing to take the risk. She began spending most of her time in the shadows, meeting with Graves in secret locations and piecing together the puzzle he had presented to her. The information he had promised was slow to come, but every so often, he would hand her a document, a recording, or a phone number that gave her more insight into the judge's web of corruption. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting meeting with Mr. Graves, Miss Miller returned to her apartment. She had barely enough strength to hold herself up, but she knew that if she didn't push through, all her work would be for nothing. She sat down at her desk, her fingers trembling as she rifled through the papers Graves had given her. There was one particular piece of evidence that caught her eye, a transcript of a conversation between the judge and an unknown person. The conversation was short, but it contained enough information to make Miss Miller's blood run cold. The judge had been accepting bribes, using his position to further his own wealth and power. And the most shocking part? The bribes were coming from a criminal organization that had been operating under the radar for years. This was bigger than she had imagined. Miss Miller sat back in her chair, stunned. The judge wasn't just a corrupt official. He was part of a much larger operation. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of what she had uncovered hitting her all at once. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about exposing a network of corruption that had taken root in the very institutions meant to protect people like her. Her mind raced with possibilities. She had the evidence she needed, but who could she trust with it? If she went to the police, would they be compromised? If she went public, could she protect herself from the people involved in this conspiracy? As she sat there, lost in thought, a knock at her door startled her. Her heart leapt in her chest. It was late, too late for anyone to be visiting her. Slowly, she stood up and moved toward the door, her hand reaching for the doorknob. She hesitated for a moment, listening carefully for any sounds beyond the door. When she heard nothing, she cracked the door open just a sliver. Standing in the doorway was a man she didn't recognize, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the hallway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark coat that seemed to blend into the night. "Miss Miller?" he asked in a low voice. "Who are you?" she demanded, her heart racing. Her hand instinctively went to the small canister of pepper spray she kept in her pocket, just in case. The man didn't seem alarmed by her defensive posture. Instead, he smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "My name is Simon," he said calmly. "I've been sent by Mr. Graves. He wants to speak with you." Now, Miss Miller's mind spun. She had been expecting communication from Mr. Graves, but she hadn't anticipated an actual visit from someone so imposing. "What does he want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Come with me, and you'll find out," Simon replied, his tone still calm but firm. Miss Miller's instincts told her something wasn't right, but she had already made her choice. If she wanted to bring the judge down and expose the corruption, she couldn't back out now. "Give me a minute," she said, her voice cold. "Let me get my things." Less than 10 minutes later, Miss Miller found herself in the back of a black car, speeding through the empty streets of the city. Simon sat beside her, silent, his eyes scanning the road ahead. She couldn't read him. His face was like a mask, blank, unreadable. As they drove, Miss Miller's thoughts raced. She had never been this deep in something like this before. She had trusted Mr. Graves, but now, as the city lights blurred past her, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Was she really in control of this situation, or was she just a pawn in someone else's game? The car finally pulled into a parking garage, its dim lights casting eerie shadows over the concrete floor. Simon got out first, then opened her door, gesturing for her to follow him. She stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady beneath her. She was sick, exhausted, but she knew she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. They walked in silence through the garage until they reached an elevator at the far end. Simon pressed the button, and the doors slid open, revealing a small, sleek interior. Miss Miller stepped inside, her heart pounding. The elevator took them up to the top floor, where Simon led her down a narrow hallway to a door at the end. He knocked once, then pushed the door open without waiting for a response. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne. Mr. Graves sat behind a large, polished desk, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He looked up as Miss Miller entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her appearance. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice smooth. "I trust you've been keeping busy." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and took a seat across from him, her eyes never leaving his. "I've been working on your project," she said, her voice sharp. "I have the information you promised me. The judge has been taking bribes from a criminal organization." Mr. Graves leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I already knew that," he said casually, "but it's good to know you're on the right track." Miss Miller's brow furrowed. "Then why am I here?" "Because we have a bigger problem," Graves replied, his smile fading. "You've been digging too deep. People are starting to notice. The judge isn't the only one involved in this mess. There are others, people you haven't even begun to uncover. If you want to expose the truth, you'll have to be prepared for what's coming next." Miss Miller's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Graves leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with intensity. "I mean, Miss Miller, that your fight for justice is about to get a lot more dangerous. And I'm not sure you're ready for what happens next." Miss Miller swallowed, feeling a knot form in her stomach. What had she gotten herself into? What was Mr. Graves really asking of her? As the seconds ticked by, she realized that the stakes had just gotten higher, and the next move would determine everything. The room fell silent as Miss Miller weighed her options. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. She had already crossed a line, and she would have to live with the consequences, no matter how dark they might become. The tension in the room felt suffocating as Miss Miller sat across from Mr. Graves, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Her mind raced with questions, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean it's going to get more dangerous?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had already stepped into a world of shadows, but what was he trying to tell her now? Graves leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he studied her with an unsettling calmness. "The judge is just the tip of the iceberg, Miss Miller," he said slowly. "You're uncovering something far bigger than you realize. A network of corruption that goes beyond just one man. There are people, powerful people, who don't want this getting out, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure it stays hidden." The air in the room grew colder as the weight of his words settled in. Miss Miller felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had suspected that the judge was just a small part of a larger operation, but hearing it from Graves made it all too real. The stakes were higher than she had imagined. "So, what do you expect me to do?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. She had been fighting for justice on her own terms, but now she was beginning to realize that it might not be so simple. Graves' lips curled into a thin smile. "I expect you to work with me, Miss Miller. You already have the information on the judge, but if you want to bring down the entire network, you'll need my help. You'll need resources, connections, things that you don't have." She bit her lip, her thoughts racing. Graves had a point. She was running out of time, both because of her illness and because of the growing web of corruption that surrounded the judge. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that working with Graves meant walking a dangerous line. Could she really trust him? Could she trust anyone in this world? "And what do you want in return?" she asked, her voice flat. She needed to know the price of his help. Graves' smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with something darker. "Nothing. For now." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But understand this, Miss Miller, power isn't free. When the time comes, you'll owe me a favor. And that favor will be something you can't refuse." Miss Miller's stomach twisted at his words. The idea of owing someone like him, someone who thrived in the shadows, made her uneasy. She was already walking a dangerous path. Could she afford to make another deal that might tie her down even further? But the truth was, she didn't have a choice. The people in power, the ones behind the judge, had more resources and influence than she could ever hope to match on her own. If she wanted to bring them down, she would need Graves' help. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to be cautious. Her gut told her that this wasn't just a simple decision. It was one that would shape everything that came next. Graves nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Take your time." But remember, Miss Miller, the clock is ticking. Every day you wait, more evidence is destroyed, more people are bought off, and those in power grow stronger. For a moment, Miss Miller stayed silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had come this far, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. Her health was deteriorating, her time was running out, and now she had to decide whether she could trust the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and long hours spent poring over legal documents, tracking down more information about the judge's criminal connections. Each time Miss Miller thought she was getting closer to exposing the truth, another obstacle appeared. Someone trying to cover up the evidence, someone trying to silence her. It felt like the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. One night, as she sat in her apartment, going over a stack of files that had been delivered to her by an anonymous source, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, her pulse quickening. Could it be Graves, reaching out to her again? Or was it someone else? Someone from the network she was trying to expose? She answered the phone cautiously. "Hello? Miss Miller," a voice said, deep and ominous. "You don't know me, but I know you. And I know what you're trying to do." Miss Miller's heart stopped. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made her skin crawl. "Who is this?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "You're getting too close," the voice continued. "The judge isn't the only one who has people watching you. You need to stop, or there will be consequences." Miss Miller felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. "I'm not stopping," she snapped. "I'm going to expose everything. Every last one of you." There was a brief pause on the other end, then the voice spoke again, colder this time. "You don't understand, Miss Miller. You're playing a game you can't win. You're out of your league. You've already made enemies, and soon, you'll regret it." The line went dead. Miss Miller sat there, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. She had been warned before, but this felt different. Whoever had just called her wasn't just threatening her. They were trying to intimidate her into backing down. And something told her that they were serious. But she couldn't stop now. She had made a promise to herself that she would bring down the corruption in the system, and no one was going to stop her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the phone call, the warning, the coldness of the voice that had threatened her. She knew she couldn't trust anyone, not even Mr. Graves, whose motivations seemed as murky as the people she was fighting against. But what was her alternative? To back down, to surrender to the very system that had failed her for so long? She couldn't. The next day, she made her decision. She would go to the press. It was a risk, one that could expose everything she had worked for. But it was the only way to ensure that the people who were pulling the strings didn't silence her for good. She reached out to a journalist she had been in contact with, someone who had been skeptical of the judge's clean image for years. The journalist had asked her to meet in a quiet cafe on the edge of town, a place where no one would recognize them. When Miss Miller arrived, the journalist was already waiting, a notebook and a pen in hand. She slid into the seat across from him, her heart pounding. "I have the evidence," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with determination. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The journalist looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "Are you sure you want to do this? Once this goes public, there's no going back." Miss Miller nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I've already made my decision. It's time for the truth to come out. And no matter what happens, I'll make sure it does." As she handed over the files, the transcripts, the recordings, the photographs that proved the judge's involvement with the criminal organization, the weight of the decision settled in her chest. She had just taken the biggest risk of her life. But as the journalist left with the evidence in hand, Miss Miller couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The phone call, the warning, it had all been a prelude to something bigger. And the real fight was just beginning. The moment she had been waiting for was about to arrive. But with it came the realization that she was no longer fighting only for justice. She was fighting for her life. And the consequences of her actions would echo far beyond what she had ever imagined. The morning after meeting with the journalist felt strangely quiet, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something monumental to happen. Miss Miller spent the hours pacing around her small apartment, waiting for the inevitable to come. Her body was still weak, the cancer sapping her energy, but her mind was sharper than ever. She knew the next few days would determine everything. She had given the journalist all the evidence, the transcripts, the recordings, the photos, everything she had uncovered about the judge's connection to the criminal network. She had crossed a line, one that she couldn't uncross. The truth would soon be out in the open, and the consequences of that truth were still unknown. The phone buzzed on her kitchen counter, breaking her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly, her heart racing. It was a message from the journalist. "I have everything. I'm meeting with my editor now. This is going to break wide. Just stay safe." Miss Miller's breath caught in her throat. The weight of the message settled over her like a heavy fog. She had done it. The story would soon be out in the open, and the entire city would know about the corruption that had taken root in the courts. She would no longer be a lone fighter against the system. The world would be watching. But then, the gnawing unease returned. She had been warned, by the anonymous caller, by Graves, by the very people she had been fighting against. She wasn't just exposing a corrupt judge anymore. She was challenging an entire network of powerful individuals. The danger had just escalated. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The apartment felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Every sound outside seemed amplified, and every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She wasn't just up against the system now. She was up against people who would do anything to protect their secrets. The day dragged on, the minutes stretching into hours. Miss Miller tried to focus on anything that might distract her, going through more files, reviewing case notes, anything to keep her mind off the overwhelming sense of impending danger. But every time she glanced out the window, she felt a strange chill run down her spine. At dusk, she received another message from the journalist. "We're going live in an hour. They won't see it coming." Her hands trembled as she read the message. It was happening. The story she had fought so hard to uncover was about to break. But with it, she knew the storm would hit. There was no turning back now. As the hour passed, she watched the clock tick closer to the time the article was set to go live. Her stomach twisted in knots. She thought of everything she had risked, the people she had trusted, the alliances she had made, and the enemies she had gained. She had already made too many enemies, and now they would know her name. The moment the clock struck the hour, her phone rang. It wasn't the journalist. It was an unknown number. Her breath hitched. She didn't hesitate. She answered it. "Miss Miller." A voice growled on the other end, rough and threatening. "You've made a big mistake." Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. "Graves," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What do you want?" "I warned you," Graves continued, his voice dripping with venom. "I told you the consequences of exposing this. You thought you could go public with this story? You thought you could expose the judge and the people behind him without any fallout?" Miss Miller's jaw clenched. "I'm not backing down," she snapped. "The truth needs to come out. No matter what you or anyone else does." Graves chuckled darkly. "You really think you're in control of this situation? You're just a pawn in a much bigger game, Miss Miller. And now that you've pushed this story out, you've put a target on your back. People won't hesitate to deal with you. You're not even on their radar yet, but now they know your name." The line went dead, and Miss Miller sat there, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her heart pounded in her chest. The words echoed in her mind, louder and louder. "You're just a pawn. A target on your back." A cold sweat broke out across her forehead as the gravity of the situation sank in. She had known the risks, but she had hoped, in the back of her mind, that maybe, just maybe, she could avoid the worst of it. But it was too late for that now. The next few hours passed in a blur. The city buzzed with news of the corruption in the courts. Reporters swarmed to the courthouse, gathering to break the story wide open. The public was in shock, and the judge's once clean reputation crumbled under the weight of the evidence that had been exposed. But even as the media circus erupted, Miss Miller knew that her role in this wasn't over. She had started a fire, and now she had to deal with the fallout. As she watched the coverage on her small television, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, it was a call. She hesitated. unsure whether she was ready to hear what awaited her on the other end. But she answered it anyway. "Miss Miller," a calm voice said, one she didn't recognize. "You don't know me, but I know what you've done." Her pulse quickened. Was this another threat? Another warning to stop? "I don't care who you are," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not backing down." The voice on the other end didn't flinch. "I'm not here to stop you," the man said. "In fact, I think what you've done is admirable, but I'm here to offer you a choice. You're in deep now. The people you've crossed are not the type to show mercy, and it's clear they won't stop until they've silenced you." Miss Miller's mind raced. "What choice are you offering?" "You can keep going down this path, and you'll likely end up dead," the man said coldly. "Or you can work with me, and I can guarantee your safety, at least for now." Miss Miller's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Was this another person trying to manipulate her? Or was it someone offering her a way out? "And what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice hardening. The man's response was simple. "The same thing as Graves, your cooperation. Help us and we'll keep you alive." The weight of his words hung in the air like a fog, suffocating her thoughts. Every option seemed like a trap. She had already made one deal she couldn't back out of, and now she was being offered another. But she couldn't afford to think about it for too long. Her life was on the line, and soon, her choices would be made for her. As the hours stretched on and the world seemed to fall apart around her, Miss Miller knew that she was caught in a web of deception and danger. She had uncovered the truth, but now she was paying the price. And the question she had to answer was whether she would continue down this path, risking everything she had left, or whether she would take a deal with the devil to stay alive. No matter what, she couldn't stop now. She had come too far. But as the darkness of the night closed in, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real game was just beginning. And in this fight, it wasn't just her life at stake. It was the future of the justice system itself. The pieces were in motion, and Miss Miller could only pray she was ready for what came next. The city lights blurred past Miss Miller as she sat in the back of a car, the engine humming in the background. The uncertainty of her situation weighed heavily on her chest. Every choice she had made, every step she had taken, had led her to this point. A point where the consequences of her actions weren't just dangerous, they were life-threatening. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, that her every move was being monitored by the very people she had exposed. The phone call from the mysterious man had shaken her, but it also opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. Would working with him really be the way to survive this storm? Or would it be another trap, another manipulation? As the car turned onto a narrow street, Miss Miller's thoughts became clearer. She had a choice to make. She could continue to expose the corruption, risking everything, or she could make a deal with this unknown man, playing the game by someone else's rules. Neither option offered the safety she longed for, but one path offered a glimmer of hope, a way out, at least for now. The car came to a stop in front of an old building, its windows dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Miss Miller's stomach twisted as she looked up at the building. It was the kind of place that looked abandoned, but she knew better. This was the meeting spot. The mysterious man had instructed her to come here if she wanted to hear his offer. She stepped out of the car, her legs unsteady. The cool night air felt like a slap to her face, and for a moment, she considered running. But she couldn't afford to run anymore. She had already taken too many risks, already crossed too many lines. She was in this now, deeper than ever before. The door to the building creaked open as she approached, and a figure stepped into view. It was Simon, the man who had brought her to Graves that first time. His face was unreadable, his eyes cold as he nodded toward her. "Come in," he said, his voice low. Miss Miller followed him inside, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the building. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. It looked like no one had been here for years, and yet, she knew this place was very much in use. They walked down a long corridor, and then Simon stopped in front of a door, knocking twice before pushing it open. Inside, the mysterious man who had called her earlier was sitting behind a large desk. His features were sharp, his eyes dark and calculating. He gestured for her to sit, his expression never changing. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge of something darker underneath. "I see you've come to hear me out." She didn't sit immediately. She stood by the door, her arms crossed, her gaze steady. "I'm here to hear what you have to say, but make it quick. I don't have much time." The man smiled, though it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone wears when they know they have the upper hand. "You're running out of time, Miss Miller. I understand. Your little exposé has already caused quite a stir. But there's more to the story than you realize. And you're not prepared for what's coming next." Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "I already know about the judge. I have the evidence to bring him down." The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You think the judge is the biggest threat?" "No. The judge is just a pawn in a much larger game. He's expendable. But the people he works for? They don't take kindly to being exposed." Miss Miller's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it aloud made it all too real. The people behind the judge, the ones pulling the strings, those were the people who had the power to end everything she had worked for. "I don't care about their threats," Miss Miller said, her voice more confident than she felt. "I'm exposing the truth. Nothing will stop me." The man leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "You're a brave woman, Miss Miller, but bravery won't save you from what's coming. The people you've crossed are powerful, more powerful than you could ever imagine. And now they know who you are. You think you can fight them with your evidence, with your legal genius? You're wrong. They'll crush you without a second thought." Miss Miller's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known that exposing the truth would come at a cost, but she hadn't expected it to feel this overwhelming. The stakes were higher than ever, and she wasn't sure if she could survive this battle. "Then what's your offer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the panic rising inside her. The man sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. "I can offer you protection. I can make sure you stay alive long enough to finish what you started. But in exchange, you need to work with me. Help me accomplish my goals, and I'll make sure you're safe. Refuse, and I'll let the others know exactly where to find you." Miss Miller's mind raced. This was it, the moment of decision. She could take the man's offer, put her trust in someone she barely knew, and hope for the best. Or she could walk away and risk everything. But even as she stood there, her resolve strengthening, she knew that there was no way out. No matter what she chose, she was already too deep. "I'll work with you," she said finally, her voice firm. The man's smile returned, this time with a hint of satisfaction. "Good choice. You'll come to understand soon enough that you have no other option. But for now, we have work to do." Over the next few weeks, Miss Miller found herself drawn deeper into the world of the mysterious man, who had made it clear that he was no friend of the people she was trying to expose. The more she worked with him, the more she realized how far-reaching the corruption went. This was no longer just about a corrupt judge. It was about an entire network of influential individuals who controlled the city from the shadows. As she pieced together more information with his help, Miss Miller's resolve began to waver. She was working with someone who was no better than the people she had been fighting against. But at the same time, she understood that her survival depended on this partnership, and that meant making difficult compromises. But even as she worked tirelessly to bring down the network, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was being manipulated. Every choice she made seemed to be dictated by forces beyond her control. She was no longer sure who was using whom, and as the web of corruption continued to unravel, Miss Miller knew that the real danger was just beginning. And yet, there was no turning back. The game had already begun, and the pieces were moving faster than she could keep up. In the end, she would have to make a choice. Would she stay true to her ideals and risk losing everything, or would she continue to work with those who had once been her enemies, bending her morals to survive? The battle for justice wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about surviving long enough to see it through to the end. The storm was coming, and Miss Miller was right in the eye of it. Miss Miller sat at a table in the dimly lit back room of a cafe, her hands clasped tightly around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She wasn't tired, at least, not physically, but her mind had become a battlefield, torn between the choices she had made and the paths that still lay ahead. Her agreement to work with the mysterious man had led her to more darkened corridors, more secret meetings. Each day, the stakes grew higher. She had hoped that aligning herself with someone who understood the dangerous world she had entered would help her find a way out. But instead, she felt more trapped than ever. The strings that had once been in her hands now seemed to be pulled by others. The man, he never introduced himself fully, always referring to himself with vague titles, like the consultant or the benefactor, had proven to be a resourceful ally. His connections were vast, his reach unfathomable. In the last few weeks, he had provided her with more pieces of the puzzle, helping her understand just how far the corruption stretched within the city's legal system. There were whispers of judges, law enforcement officers, businessmen, even politicians, people in positions of power who had all benefited from the illegal activities that had flourished under the judge's reign. Yet, as Miss Miller looked over the files the man had given her, there was still one question she couldn't answer. What was his true goal? She had begun to suspect that her new ally had motives of his own, ones that went far beyond her fight for justice. She turned the page of the document in front of her, her eyes scanning the names, dates, and amounts. Every name listed in the file seemed to represent someone who had profited from the corruption. She had all the evidence she needed to expose them. But there was no denying that the forces arrayed against her were growing stronger, more dangerous. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. "We need to meet. Bring the files." The message was from the consultant. She stared at the screen for a moment, her stomach sinking. She hadn't seen him in days, and every meeting she had with him only seemed to raise more questions. What did he want now? She glanced out the cafe window, watching the street below. There was no turning back. Whatever game she was playing, the final moves were fast approaching. She had to stay one step ahead of the forces conspiring against her, even if that meant making uncomfortable deals. An hour later, Miss Miller found herself at the same darkened building where she had first met the consultant. The air felt thicker tonight, as if the weight of her choices hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Simon, the consultant's silent companion, was waiting for her by the door. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was a tension in the way he stood that made her uneasy. They led her into the building and down the long, narrow hallway that she was now all too familiar with. Simon didn't speak, but his presence was as commanding as ever. The consultant was waiting for her in the same room, his sharp eyes studying her as she stepped inside. "Miss Miller," he said, a small smile curling at the corner of his mouth. "You've been busy. I hope you've brought the files." She nodded, placing the folder on the table between them. "I've been digging, like you asked," she said, her voice calm, "but I still don't understand. What exactly are you hoping to gain from all of this?" The consultant's smile widened, but there was something unsettling in it. "I think you know exactly what I want, Miss Miller," he replied smoothly. "The truth. The system you're trying to tear down. It's broken, it's corrupt, and I plan to help you fix it." Miss Miller narrowed her eyes. She had heard these words before, but they had never felt so hollow. "You've been helping me, but every time I think we're getting somewhere, it feels like you're holding something back." The consultant leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. Yes. The question that everyone asks. What's my true motive? You're clever, Miss Miller, but I think you've already figured it out." She was silent for a long moment, her mind running through the possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle had started to fall into place, but she still didn't know whether she was just another pawn in someone else's game. "I'm not in this for power," she said, her voice steady, though she couldn't hide the doubt creeping into her chest. "I'm in this for justice, to expose what's been hidden in the dark corners of this system." "But you—" The consultant raised a hand, silencing her. "I never said you weren't in this for justice," he interrupted. "But think about it, Miss Miller. You have the files. You have the evidence. But what are you really going to do with it? If you go public, the media will pick it up, the city will be shocked. And then what? The people in power will make a few changes, maybe some heads will roll, but the system will still be as corrupt as ever. You can't fix it with a single expose. Not alone." Miss Miller's chest tightened. "So, what are you suggesting? That I work with you to fix the system?" The consultant's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. You and I, we can tear it all down. We can rebuild it into something that works for the people, not the powerful. But it's going to take more than just exposing the truth. It's going to take control. Control. The word lingered in the air like a poison. Miss Miller's hands clenched into fists. She had always been fighting for justice, for the truth to come out. But the idea of controlling the system, of working alongside someone who played a game much darker than hers, it made her stomach turn. "You want to control it?" she asked, her voice rising. "You want to manipulate it just like they have?" The consultant's expression never faltered. "I want to rebuild it. There's a difference. But I can't do that alone. I need someone like you. Someone who understands how the law works, someone who isn't afraid to challenge the system. If you really want to make a difference, Miss Miller, this is the only way. You can't fight corruption if you're not in the room where the decisions are made." Miss Miller sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. She had fought so long to bring down those in power, and now this man was offering her a seat at the table. The temptation was real. But the cost of that seat? It was something she wasn't sure she was willing to pay. "You want me to be part of the very thing I've been fighting against," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "To become part of the corruption?" The consultant's smile remained in place, but his eyes were cold. "I'm offering you a chance to make real change, Miss Miller. To take the power away from the people who've been abusing it. But to do that, you need to be in a position where you can influence things. And if you refuse, well, you'll be just another casualty of this broken system." The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of his words pressing on her chest. What was the right choice? Could she really accept this man's offer? Could she really turn the tables on the very system she had been trying to tear down? For the first time in her life, Miss Miller wasn't sure what to do. The storm that had been building for months was finally reaching its peak. Miss Miller had already sacrificed so much. Her health, her peace of mind, her moral compass. And now, the question was whether she would continue down this dangerous path or find a way to step back from the edge. The choices she had made so far had set her on a course that was impossible to undo. But as the consultant's offer loomed before her, she realized that she was standing at a precipice. What would happen next would change everything. And it was a choice she could never take back. The game had become much more complicated, and the consequences of each move would be more devastating than ever. The weight of the decision hung over Miss Miller like a cloud, dark and suffocating. As the consultant's words echoed in her mind, she struggled to make sense of the choice that lay before her. She had come this far, exposed so much corruption, and now, the very system she had tried to take down was offering her a seat at its table. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, for the truth to come out, but now, it felt as if she was being asked to betray everything she had stood for. The consultant leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Think it over, Miss Miller," he said, his voice calm but heavy with unspoken meaning. "But remember, the clock is ticking. There are people out there who are watching you, and they will not stop until you're silenced. The only way to protect yourself, to finish what you've started, is to accept the power that comes with controlling the system. You can fight it, or you can change it from within." Miss Miller's hands were trembling as she clasped them together. Her heart was racing, but her mind was eerily calm, as if trying to block out the noise of the decision. She stared at the files spread out before her, the evidence that could topple an empire of corruption, and yet, she felt so small in the face of what she had uncovered. The forces she was up against were powerful, dangerous, and it seemed like no matter how much she fought, she was always one step behind. But then, something inside her snapped. A surge of clarity broke through the fog of doubt. She had already given up so much, sacrificed so much for the truth. She couldn't let the darkness consume her now. She couldn't become the very thing she had spent her entire life fighting against. "I'm not going to be your puppet," Miss Miller said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "I didn't come this far to turn into one of them." The consultant's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of irritation passing over his features before he masked it with a calm smile. "I see. You're determined to walk your own path, even if it leads to your destruction. I'd rather die fighting for what's right than live in a world where I compromise everything I believe in," Miss Miller said, her voice stronger now, the fire of her convictions burning bright. The consultant sighed, leaning forward, his expression unreadable. "You are a stubborn woman, Miss Miller. But that will make things much more interesting." He stood and walked toward the door. "I offered you a chance to be part of something bigger, something that could truly change the system. But now, you'll have to face the consequences on your own. And believe me, Miss Miller, the consequences of going public with what you've discovered will be far worse than anything you've encountered so far." With that, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence that followed. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Miss Miller alone, her thoughts swirling like a storm. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. The tension in the city was palpable, and Miss Miller could feel it creeping into every corner of her life. The media had picked up on the story she had started, but it had only created more chaos. People were demanding answers, the public was outraged, and the pressure on the authorities was mounting. But Miss Miller knew that the people in power wouldn't go down without a fight. She had stirred a hornet's nest, and now, they were coming for her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. She had noticed a black SUV parked outside her apartment building every day for the past 3 days. She had seen the same man in a suit at the corner cafe, always staring at her, never making eye contact, but always there. It was clear that the forces she was up against were already tracking her every move. Her phone buzzed in the silence of her apartment. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from the journalist she had worked with earlier, the one who had helped expose the corruption. "We need to talk. Meet me tonight. I've got something big." Miss Miller's stomach churned. The message could mean anything. The journalist could have uncovered new evidence, or perhaps someone had threatened him into staying silent. Either way, she knew that meeting him was dangerous. But she had no choice. She had to keep going, even if it meant putting herself in more danger. That evening, she arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet. It was quiet, the usual hum of the city outside barely audible over the soft jazz music playing inside. The journalist was already sitting at a table in the back, his eyes scanning the room nervously. He looked over at her as she approached, his face tense, his usual confident demeanor replaced with unease. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Miss Miller said, trying to keep her tone light, but she couldn't mask the anxiety in her own chest. The journalist gave a shaky laugh. "I might have, after what I've learned." He gestured for her to sit, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed a folder across the table. "I've been digging into the judge's financials, like we talked about, and what I found, well, it's bigger than anything we thought." Miss Miller's pulse quickened as she opened the folder. Inside were documents showing evidence of money laundering, illegal campaign donations, and connections to even more powerful figures she had never imagined. The web of corruption was even wider than she had known. "There's more," the journalist continued, his voice low. "I found out about a secret meeting between the judge and someone big. I don't know who, but they were talking about a final solution. I think they're planning to take care of you, Miss Miller." Miss Miller's heart raced. The words "final solution" echoed in her mind, sending a cold shiver down her spine. She had suspected she was being watched, but hearing that they were planning to eliminate her was a punch to the gut. "How do we stop them?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The journalist looked around nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. "I don't know if we can stop them, but I've got a contact, someone who can get us more information. If we act fast, we might be able to use it to protect you, and maybe expose them for good." Miss Miller's mind raced. This was it, the final push. She had everything she needed to take down the corrupt network, but she also had the most dangerous people in the city closing in on her. It was now or never. If she acted too late, they would silence her before she could expose everything. "I don't have much time," Miss Miller said, standing up abruptly. "Meet me tomorrow, same time. Bring everything you've got." The journalist nodded, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Be careful, Miss Miller. They're on to you. You can't keep playing this game without consequences." As Miss Miller walked out of the cafe, her heart pounding, she knew that the next day would be the most dangerous yet. She had one chance to expose everything, to bring down the system that had corrupted so many lives. But the forces against her were stronger than ever. The storm was finally here, and she was right in the middle of it. The next morning, Miss Miller woke up with a sense of urgency. The journalist's warning echoed in her mind. They're on to you. She knew the truth of it. She could feel the weight of the danger closing in, but she couldn't stop now. Not after everything she had sacrificed to uncover the corruption in the city's legal system. She couldn't afford to back down. The stakes were too high, and every second counted. She quickly dressed, her movements sharp and deliberate. The files the journalist had handed her were now scattered across her desk, each document representing the years of work, the countless hours spent piecing together a story that would shake the foundations of the city. She had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from the journalist. Meet me at the warehouse. Same time, but hurry. I've got the final piece. Miss Miller didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag, stuffed the documents into it, and left her apartment in a hurry. As she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the very walls of the building were closing in on her. She kept her head down, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. But she knew the moment she stepped into the open, she would be a target. The warehouse was located on the outskirts of town, an isolated place where few would think to look. She'd been there before, and the sense of danger still lingered in the air. The familiar scent of dust and old wood hit her as she pushed the door open. The place was dark, with only a few shafts of light filtering through the cracks in the windows. She scanned the room, her eyes falling on the journalist, who was sitting at a rickety table, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as she entered, his face pale and drawn. "You made it," he said quietly, his voice tense. "I don't know how much longer I can stay in one piece, Miss Miller. They know I've been talking to you. They're everywhere now." "I know," she said, her voice low but steady. "We don't have much time. What did you find?" The journalist handed her a manila envelope, his hands shaking slightly. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. Inside were more files, documents that detailed not just the judge's illegal activities, but also the powerful figures backing him. Names she didn't recognize, but knew immediately were connected to the highest levels of power in the city. There was also a detailed list of transactions, evidence of bribes, kickbacks, and deals made in dark corners of the city. The documents were more damning than anything she had seen before. But what caught her attention the most was the final piece. A handwritten note, attached to a photograph of the judge in a private meeting with a man who was clearly someone of great influence. The note was short, but it carried a chilling message. The judge is expendable. The next target is Miss Miller. Miss Miller's heart stopped for a moment. She had known she was a target, but seeing it in black and white, with her own name on it, made the reality hit harder than ever. "They're coming for me," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "We need to expose this now. The public needs to know everything." The journalist looked around nervously, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. "Miss Miller, we've done all we can. But the people you're up against, they have resources. They have people who will stop at nothing to protect themselves. I've already seen some of their men outside. They're closing in." Miss Miller's eyes flashed with determination. "I'm not backing down. I've come too far and I won't stop now. We expose everything. We make sure the world knows what these people have done." The journalist hesitated, his face full of doubt. "You're walking into a trap. They'll destroy you." But Miss Miller's resolve was unshakable. "If I don't act now, they'll destroy everything I've worked for. I won't let them get away with it." She stood up, her movements decisive. "I'm going to take this to the press. We can't wait any longer." "Miss Miller, don't," the journalist called out, standing up in alarm. "You don't understand. They'll—" But before he could finish, the sound of a door creaking open interrupted him. Miss Miller froze, her blood running cold. She heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps. She turned quickly, reaching for the gun she kept tucked inside her bag. But before she could react, a figure stepped into the dim light of the warehouse. It was Simon. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to show up here. She thought he was a part of the consultants' team, but this felt different. His eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You shouldn't have come here," Simon said, his voice calm but laced with a threat. He was holding something in his hand, and Miss Miller immediately recognized it. A small radio transmitter. "You were always too eager," he continued, stepping further into the room. "Too eager to play the hero. But there's no room for heroes in this game. You're out of your depth, Miss Miller. You've made your move. Now we make ours." Miss Miller's eyes narrowed. "You won't get away with this. I have everything I need to bring you all down." Simon chuckled, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was cold, calculating. "You think you've won? This city is ours. You're just a pawn, and pawns get sacrificed. It's that simple." The journalist's voice cracked, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Miss Miller, you need to get out of here." "There." Before he could finish, Simon's eyes flicked toward him, and in that moment, the journalist's body went rigid, as if frozen in place. A second later, Simon nodded, and two more figures appeared behind him, blocking the exit. The room went silent, the air thick with tension. Miss Miller could feel her pulse hammering in her neck. She was cornered. But then, something shifted in her. She had fought so hard, come so far. She couldn't let Simon or anyone else control her fate now. Her hand shot out, grabbing the envelope with the files, clutching it tightly as if it were her lifeline. "You think I'm a pawn?" Miss Miller said, her voice filled with fire. "Well, you're wrong. I'm the one who's going to win this game. And you're going to regret underestimating me." She moved quickly, not hesitating for a second, and in one fluid motion, she tossed the files toward the journalist. The movement distracted Simon for just a moment, enough for Miss Miller to reach into her bag and pull out her phone. She dialed a number she had never thought she'd need, 911, and then she spoke into the phone, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "I need immediate backup. There's an illegal operation in progress at the warehouse. There's a judge involved and multiple high-profile people. Send someone, fast." She hung up before Simon could react. For the first time since entering this fight, Miss Miller felt a sense of hope. She had just called for help, but it wasn't just anyone she had reached out to. It was a trusted ally who owed her a favor. She knew they would come, and when they did, it would be over for Simon and the people behind him. The game had changed, and now the storm wasn't just on the horizon. It was right above them. The clock was ticking. The final confrontation was about to begin. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Miss Miller's heart raced as she stood there, facing Simon and the two silent figures flanking him. Her mind was spinning, calculating, trying to figure out her next move. The file she had tossed to the journalist was now in his trembling hands, and she could see him quickly flipping through it, his face a mix of fear and disbelief. "You're making a mistake, Miss Miller," Simon said, his voice icy and calm. "You're not in control here. You never were." Miss Miller's grip tightened around her phone. Her breath was shallow, but she kept her composure. The call had been made. Help was on its way. She just had to survive long enough for it to get there. The journalist looked up at her, his face pale, his eyes wide. You really think they'll come?" he asked, his voice shaky. "You're not sure." "They'll come," she replied firmly, cutting him off. "We don't have much time, but they'll come. And when they do, we have to make sure we're ready." Simon took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers, a dangerous smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Ready for what? To be arrested? To face the consequences of your foolishness?" His voice grew colder, his expression hardening. "There's no escape for you, Miss Miller. Not anymore." Miss Miller's mind raced. She was outnumbered, cornered, but she wasn't done yet. There had to be something she could do, some way to turn the tables. Her eyes flicked toward the open door. The building was empty except for them, and there was no backup yet, but she couldn't let them know that. The trap was closing in around her, but she had to stall, keep Simon distracted just a little longer. Suddenly, she saw a glint of something behind Simon, just a reflection in the dim light. Without thinking, she pushed the journalist toward the far wall, behind the rows of wooden crates stacked high. "Stay low," she whispered urgently. The journalist hesitated, then quickly nodded, scrambling to the corner, out of sight. Simon's attention flickered briefly to the movement, and Miss Miller didn't waste the chance. She bolted toward the door, her legs moving faster than she thought they could. She reached it just as Simon shouted behind her, but the door slammed shut with a loud bang. She wasn't out yet. She bolted down the narrow hallway, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Her heart pounded in her ears, and the sound of heavy footsteps following her sent a wave of panic surging through her chest. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Ahead, she could see a window, a small one, too high to climb through easily, but it was something. If she could get to it, she might have a chance to escape. She sprinted toward it, barely avoiding the sound of Simon's voice shouting orders behind her. "Don't let her escape," Simon yelled. "She's the key. Don't let her get away." She reached the window, her hands clammy as she grabbed the metal bars. They were old, rusted, but sturdy. She threw her weight against them, hoping to break the lock. Her body shook with the effort, but she refused to stop. This was her only shot. Finally, with a groan of protest, the bars gave way, and she pushed the window open. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked down at the ground below, far too high to jump without breaking something, but there was no time to hesitate. The voices behind her were getting closer. They would catch up soon. A figure appeared in the distance, emerging from a shadow. Miss Miller's heart sank. Was it Simon coming to stop her? But as the figure drew nearer, she saw that it wasn't Simon. The figure was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and their movements were quick and purposeful. It was too dark to see their face, but the person was heading straight toward her. There was a moment of indecision as Miss Miller prepared to make her escape anyway, even if she didn't know if this was friend or foe. But then, a voice, one that Miss Miller had never expected to hear again, rang out. Miss Miller. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the voice. It was the journalist contact, the one person who had promised to help them. Without a second thought, Miss Miller darted toward the figure, who quickly ducked under the window and grabbed her arm. Quickly, the man urged, pulling her down behind a stack of crates. They've set up a perimeter. You need to move fast. For the first time in what felt like weeks, Miss Miller felt a spark of hope. What are you doing here? She asked breathlessly, trying to keep her voice low. How did you find me? The man gave her a wry smile, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I'm the one who made sure the backup was coming. I told you to trust me. He pulled a small earpiece from his pocket and quickly inserted it into his ear. We've got your back, but we can't stay here much longer. They're going to sweep this whole area. As he spoke, Miss Miller's phone buzzed again. She glanced down and saw a message from the same number that had helped her earlier, the trusted ally. Backup is on the way. Hold tight. We'll get you out. Miss Miller let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the feeling of safety didn't last long. From the far end of the warehouse, she heard voices shouting, more footsteps getting closer. The men Simon had brought were closing in, and they wouldn't stop until she was captured. How much longer? Miss Miller asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, urgency flooding her every word. The man with her scanned the area quickly, adjusting his stance to block her from view. We're running out of time, he muttered under his breath. If we don't move now, we won't make it. Are you ready? Miss Miller nodded, tightening her grip on the file that had become her lifeline. The file contained everything that could bring down the entire network of corruption. She had to protect it. The sound of footsteps grew louder. They were getting closer. On my mark, the man said, his voice low and focused. Move fast and stay close. Don't let them see you. He gave her a quick glance, and before she could process it, he motioned for her to move. They darted across the floor of the warehouse, taking a route that kept them hidden behind piles of crates and industrial equipment. Every step felt like it could be their last, but they pushed on, moving swiftly and silently. The tension in the air was suffocating. Every door they passed, every shadow, seemed to hold the promise of discovery. Finally, they reached the back door, which led to an alley. The man quickly glanced around before pulling open the door, ushering her through. Go, he hissed. This way. Just as they stepped into the alley, a vehicle, a sleek black SUV, pulled up. The doors swung open, and a familiar face greeted Miss Miller. "You've got to be quick," the man said, urging her toward the vehicle. Miss Miller didn't hesitate this time. She hopped into the SUV, her heart pounding. She glanced over her shoulder as the vehicle sped off, the warehouse disappearing into the distance. But she knew this was far from over. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next few hours were a blur of movement. Miss Miller was safely hidden, for the moment. The documents were in safe hands, and the backup had arrived just in time. But as she leaned back in the seat, the reality of the situation hit her once again. The battle she had started wasn't just about bringing down one corrupt judge. It was about bringing down an entire system, a system that had already shown it would do anything to protect itself. And she had just become the most wanted person in the city. The game had changed. The stakes were higher. But Miss Miller wasn't backing down. She had come too far to stop now. And this time, she was going to take the fight to them. The storm was here, and she would make sure they felt every drop. The night felt thick with tension, like a storm just before it broke. Miss Miller sat in the back of the SUV, her mind racing as the city passed by in a blur of lights. She had escaped the warehouse, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Simon and the people he worked for would be hunting her, and the clock was ticking. She couldn't hide forever. The man sitting next to her, the one who had helped her escape the warehouse, was staring at the road ahead, his expression unreadable. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white. She knew he wasn't just driving her away from danger. He was leading her somewhere. Somewhere that would give her a chance to turn the tables. "Where are we going?" Miss Miller asked, her voice low. She knew she had to be careful. The allies she had now were few, and she wasn't entirely sure she could trust them. But for now, she had no choice. The man glanced at her briefly, his eyes sharp. "You're going to meet someone who can help you. Someone who's been tracking Simon and his group for a while now." Miss Miller's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" The man remained silent for a moment, his focus unwavering as he navigated the streets. Finally, he spoke again. "Someone who's been on the inside. Someone with information about the network. They've been monitoring Simon's every move." Miss Miller leaned back in her seat, the weight of his words settling over her like a cloak. A mole inside Simon's group? That was exactly what she needed. Someone who could give her the upper hand. Someone who could expose everything she had been fighting for. But as the car sped through the city, the reality of the situation became clear. Even with this new ally, she was up against an entire system. Simon and his team weren't just going to let her walk away. They would come after her again. And when they did, they would make sure she didn't have a chance to fight back. She pulled the envelope, the one containing the damning evidence, closer to her chest. She couldn't afford to lose it. This was the key to bringing the whole operation down. Without it, everything she had done would be for nothing. They drove for what felt like hours, leaving the city behind and heading into a quieter part of the countryside. The roads grew more isolated, the buildings fewer and farther apart. Miss Miller tried to steady her nerves, but she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was never far behind. Every sound, every movement made her jump. Eventually, the SUV pulled into a secluded compound. It was an old building, tucked away behind high gates, surrounded by trees. The man parked the car and motioned for Miss Miller to follow him. "This is it," he said, his voice grim. "We'll be safe here for now." Miss Miller stepped out of the vehicle, her legs still shaky from the tension of the night. She followed the man through the gates, her senses heightened as she scanned the area. They moved quickly through the compound, past buildings that looked like they had been abandoned for years. Finally, they reached a small building at the far end of the compound, its door slightly ajar. The man knocked twice before stepping inside. Miss Miller hesitated for a moment, then followed him in. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. A single desk sat in the center, papers scattered across it. The room smelled like old books and dust. Behind the desk sat a woman, her back to the door, her head bent over some papers. She didn't look up when they entered. "Miss Miller," the woman said, her voice calm but tinged with authority. "I've been expecting you." Miss Miller's heart raced. How could this woman know who she was? Was she part of Simon's team? Was this another trap? But the man beside her spoke up. "She's the one I told you about. The one who's been working to take down Simon's network." The woman turned around, her expression serious. "I know who you are, Miss Miller," she said. "I've been following your progress for some time. I've been waiting for the right moment to reach out." Miss Miller narrowed her eyes. "How do I know I can trust you?" The woman leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "You don't, but you don't have a choice. Simon's group is closing in on you, and I'm your best chance to stay alive and finish what you started." Miss Miller studied the woman carefully. There was something about her calm demeanor that put her at ease, but she knew better than to trust anyone too easily. Still, for the moment, she had no other options. "Tell me what you know," Miss Miller said, her voice steady, "and how you plan to help me bring Simon and his people down." The woman nodded. "I've been tracking Simon for months. He's been working with people who are higher up in the political and criminal world than you could imagine. I have the resources, the intel, to bring it all into the light. But we have to act fast." Miss Miller felt a surge of hope. This was it. This was the break she had been waiting for. If this woman had the connections, the information she needed, maybe, just maybe, she could bring down the entire corrupt system. But even as hope flared inside her, she knew the danger was far from over. Simon's network wasn't just a few corrupt officials. They were everywhere. They had the power to destroy lives, to crush anyone who stood in their way. And she was now a marked target. The woman sat down at the desk and began pulling files from drawers, spreading them out in front of Miss Miller. "This is everything you need to take Simon and his network down," she said. "But you're going to need to work fast. The longer we wait, the more likely it is they'll catch up to us." Miss Miller nodded, her mind racing as she looked through the files. Everything she had uncovered over the past few months had led to this moment. The people in power, the illegal dealings, the ties between the judge, Simon, and a network of powerful figures. It was all here. The truth was finally within reach. But the cost of exposing that truth was something she couldn't ignore. Simon's people would stop at nothing to protect themselves. And Miss Miller knew that even with all the evidence in the world, she was now in a fight for her life. "We have one shot at this," Miss Miller said, her voice sharp. "We can't afford to make any mistakes." The woman gave a brief nod. "I agree. And we'll need more than just the evidence. We'll need allies, people in the right positions to take action once the truth comes out." Miss Miller's mind flashed to the media, the journalist who had helped her, and the powerful allies she had already contacted. If they worked together, they could create a storm powerful enough to bring the entire system down. She glanced at the woman in front of her. "Let's make sure we're ready," Miss Miller said. "We have to hit them where it hurts, hard and fast." The woman's eyes gleamed with understanding. "You're not just exposing corruption, Miss Miller. You're starting a revolution." The final pieces were falling into place. The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally here. And Miss Miller was no longer just fighting for justice. She was fighting to bring down an empire of lies, and she would do whatever it took to see it through. As the woman handed her the final files, Miss Miller stood up, her resolve as solid as steel. She had one chance left. It was time to make the final move. The battle had only just begun.